year 1720, England was a nation of striking contrasts. While the more fortunate of its citizens enjoyed great prosperity, the rest lived in terrible poverty. The English were boastfully proud of a political system which, in reality, was riddled with corruption. It was this ambiguous society that provided the inspiration for an artist starting his career in the 1720s, the first of the English masters and one of the greatest satirists, William Hogarth.
It's interesting to reflect that so many of the political satirists of our own time have shown a great admiration for Hogarth's work, and he's still somebody who's in the firmament there. He is almost a kind of problem parent of English art. On the one hand, he is the first British artist to achieve an international reputation, and yet at the same time there's always that sneaking feeling that what he's doing isn't quite art, and that irreverence that one finds in Hogarth certainly damaged his reputation in his own lifetime.
He was a great believer in being British. He sometimes signed his pictures Britophil, meaning lover of Britain. Looking at it from a distance, he drove English art forward.
Hogarth picked up on traits that are universal, that are basic universal human traits, and he showed them up within the 18th century society, just as much as they exist today within our society.
But Hogarth was a man of contradictions. Much of his work was shamelessly populist, yet he longed for recognition as a genius of high art. Although Hogarth was an Englishman who condemned other nations bitterly, he often looked to Europe for artistic inspiration. His life was one of great success, but his final years saw him increasingly marginalized. In 1703, Richard Hogarth opened a coffee house at St. John's Gate in London. His coffee house was one of the more unusual of the many such establishments in London at the time, as the only language that could be spoken on the premises was Latin. This venture folded after 5 years, leaving its owner crippled with debt. For the next 4 years, Richard Hogarth and his family were confined to London's infamous debtors' prison, the Fleet.
Himself having to go into prison at the time that Hogarth's father did, he probably realised that life could be very bad indeed, could be very dire. And I think that gave him a sense of darkness that one sees in his art.
Hogarth was, in a sense, launched into this situation where he had to move straight into business very early in his life. And so he never really had the training that perhaps another artist like him would have had.
When Richard Hogarth was eventually released from prison in 1712, his son, William Hogarth, was 14 years of age. Over the following years, William saw his father attempt to compile a definitive Latin dictionary. The failure of this project triggered Richard Hogarth's early death in 1718. By that time, William Hogarth had decided to pursue a career as an artist. Ironically, the greatest art of his career would be so informed with literary value that Hogarth would ultimately be compared with Shakespeare. In 1718, such dizzy heights of achievement were a long way off. That year, William Hogarth worked in London as an apprentice to the engraver Ellis Gamble. In April 1720, despite having no formal artistic training, Hogarth announced himself to the world as an engraver of prints. Later that year, he began to attend the Art Academy in St. Martin's Lane, and a few months later, he produced his first engravings. These included the South Sea Scheme, a print inspired by the insane financial speculation that had afflicted all sections of English society only months before, leaving many investors ruined. Hogarth chose to represent the speculation as a symbolic merry-go-round. The topical 1724 print Masquerades and Operas satirises the London fashion for continental entertainments, such as Italian opera. In Hogarth's image, the people flock to these performances, failing to notice that works by English literary greats, such as Shakespeare, are being taken away as waste paper. This early print reveals much about concerns that would stay with Hogarth throughout his career. It is an undoubtedly satirical work, and Hogarth continually chose to direct his satire at all things foreign.
Not even Britishness, Englishness figured very largely in Hogarth. Born in London, he was more or less a Cockney. The London Gossip Society was what he really revelled in. Intellectuals and writers and people who he gradually grew up with, who became his friends, were the central core of his work.
He disliked all these paintings from abroad that people had in their houses. They were rather dark, dirty paintings which people seemed to like to buy. Apart from France, he hadn't been abroad. There were no proper reproductions in those days apart from engravings, so he probably wouldn't have seen the great art that was in Rome, for example.
Hogarth was 22 when he began studying at St. Martin's Academy, and he was a pupil at Covent Garden under the English history painter Sir James Thornhill, a relationship that would have a great influence on Hogarth's personal life. It was 1728 before Hogarth's earliest paintings began to appear, by which time he was already 30 years of age.
Hogarth started painting at a late age because he couldn't afford to do so beforehand. The cost of being an apprentice in the 18th century was related to the kind of trade you did. Painters were grander than engravers and it cost more, so he went for the cheap option and also the safer option. And it's only when he starts being successful as an engraver and can begin to make a bit of money that he could actually afford to go into painting. He did study at the St. Martin's Lane Academy. This would have taught him drawing rather than painting. And perhaps it's one of the very interesting things about Hogarth that somebody who is such a wonderful painter was largely self-taught.
John Gay's The Beggar's Opera mocked the pretensions of grand opera by using characters drawn from ordinary life. Criminals and prostitutes ironically adopted the mannerisms of the nobility, and the English public loved it. William Hogarth was a huge admirer of The Beggar's Opera, and he decided to paint a key scene from within it. This is the moment when the manacled highwayman Macheath watches as his two mistresses beg their fathers to intercede for his life, unaware that both have a financial interest in his being hanged. By the late 1720s, another European fashion swept English society: conversation pieces. These small images typically depicted a wealthy family engaged in polite social activity, such as playing cards or talking in the garden. Hogarth took on a number of these commissions, including this image of the courtier Sir Andrew Fountaine and his family.
When Hogarth first started to paint, he first initially started to produce things like conversation pieces. And there was quite a vogue for this kind of painting at the time. That gave him a certain amount of basic income.
Vater was very fashionable in England in the early 18th century, and there was a particular type of painting which we call the conversation piece, which seemed very well adapted to Watteau's art. This is something that Hogarth looked at very carefully. He was interested in the Rococo style altogether, and a lot of the eroticism that you find in Hogarth's work seems to come from that French source.
Hogarth's willingness to embrace continental influences was a response to the market conditions of the time. It is an unusual feature of Hogarth's life that he was as concerned with the economic rewards of his art as with his art itself. But in 1729, his need for money also increased when he married Jane Thornhill, daughter of his former tutor, Sir James Thornhill.
Money was the central concern for Hogarth. Partly that was probably because of his background, He wanted to have a sound financial base to himself. But at the same time, money gave him an intro into society. And if you didn't have it, you couldn't meet all of the people that he wanted to meet.
Although Hogarth was able to make a living from painting conversation pieces, as the 1730s began, he conceived a far greater ambition in his work. Drawing on his love of the theatre, he decided to create a series of paintings which would tell an easily understood story. He would then make engravings of the images and sell them directly to the public. These would be scenes with a strong moral element, emphasizing the grim consequences of making the wrong decisions in life. But they would also be contemporary in their subject matter and rich with humour. Hogarth judged that there would be a substantial market for what he called his modern moral subjects. He was to be proved right.
The whole idea of the modern moral subject really comes from the theatre. He knew how actors behaved, how they worked. He knew about gestures. He knew about expressions. He knew how to observe all the details of the way people behave together. And I think this is really the basis of his success.
They told stories. And because he was interested in the way that writers articulated their ideas, then this came out in his painting.
In 1731, Hogarth announced a subscription for the first series of his modern moral subjects. The Harlot's Progress is a 6-part story detailing the unfortunate life of Moll Hackabout, a young woman who becomes a prostitute upon her arrival in London. As the story unfolds, Moll's life is initially content, as she becomes mistress to a wealthy Jew whilst keeping her own younger lover. But events then begin to transpire against her. Abandoned by her lovers, she becomes an ordinary street prostitute, leading to her arrest and subsequent imprisonment. Though Moll is released, she has already contracted syphilis. Her whole sad existence has lasted just 23 years. At first glance, this is a simple morality tale, a warning against a life of ill repute. But there is far more to the Harlot's Progress than the preaching of virtue. Although Moll made the wrong decision, Hogarth's carefully chosen detail enables us to understand her situation. She has found herself in a city full of dubious characters. Moll's naturally happy disposition is no defense against such a hostile environment, and this is the real subject of Hogarth's satire.
In The Harlot's Progress, you will find that there is a kind of inevitable progression from one stage to another, and one might say that in every picture you see a sense of loss. She's lost something. From the first picture to the second picture, she loses her virtue, then she loses her wealth, then she loses her freedom, and finally she loses her health and she dies. And you can see all these losses going one after another, each picture one stage further in this progress towards death.
The Harlot's Progress featured characters who were based on real individuals, whose notoriety was public knowledge at the time. In 1730, a woman named Kate Hackabout was convicted for immoral earnings by the notorious magistrate John Gonson, the man arriving to arrest Moll in Plate 3. Hogarth was well aware of the cult of celebrity, a familiar phenomenon today.
Hogarth was something of a visual diarist of his day. We can all actually think of this situation today with magazines like Private Eye, and they tend to lampoon all these prominent politicians. That whole system went on in Hogarth's day.
He made prints of many of his portraits. These were actually displayed in the windows of print shops. These print shops had glazing bars, and within each little window there would be a picture. And so these attracted the crowds. Sometimes they didn't have the name underneath, and people would come along and try and guess who the pictures were about. So that's why he actually used real individuals.
London was, of course, a much smaller place in those days, and you would have found that people who were about the town, so to speak, would know about, say, Mother Needham, the celebrated bawd, or Gonson, the magistrate who arrested prostitutes and things like that. So they would be well-known figures, though we should remember that he doesn't actually name them. I mean, we know who they are, and we can reconstruct that from the information about them. I think it's more a matter of if the cap fits, that he wouldn't have actually named them in person, because he could have been liable for libel, of course, but he could do pictures of them and he could show them doing the kinds of things that people always associated them with.
The Harlot's Progress was a huge success, but within weeks of its publication, illegally pirated prints were being sold in London. The business-minded Hogarth responded by issuing his own cut-price version, but he was soon able to effect a far more permanent solution to what was a widespread problem. He campaigned for laws to protect the copyright of engravings, and with the help of his friends in Parliament, the Engravers' Copyright Act was passed in 1735. It became known universally after its main advocate, Hogarth's Act.
Before Hogarth, there had been no form of copyright. And he realised that this was what was needed to protect people's rights within their own work. It was first formulated as an engraving act, but it then, in fact, expanded right out to become the Copyright Acts in film and video and books, and anything, in fact, that could become pirated by counterfeiters.
Although we think that this protected things, it only did to a certain degree. You couldn't copy an engraving that had been published, but you could copy drawings and ideas. What would sometimes happen with Hogarth is that when people knew that Hogarth was doing a new series, they'd sneak into his studio and they would get ideas of what he was doing, sometimes asking him questions, say pretending to be somebody who wanted to subscribe, and then they'd rush off and do their own drawing and publish it for him.
Hogarth's next project, The Rake's Progress, was delivered in June 1735, shortly after Hogarth's Act became law. The prints were hugely popular, and, unlike The Harlot's Progress, the original paintings of this second series have also survived. Now in Sir John Soane's museum in London, these 8 canvases again reveal the terrible consequences of human folly. In this case, the financial recklessness of Tom Rakewell, a wealthy young man of society. Hogarth's visual narrative shows him first taking possession of his inheritance before he squanders it all on drink, gambling, and fair-weather friends. In an attempt to avoid financial ruin, he marries a wealthy old woman. But even this desperate measure fails to save him from prison and, ultimately, madness. In the final scene, Tom Rakewell is confined to London's Bethlehem Hospital for the Insane, the notorious Bedlam. The unfolding visual drama of The Rake's Progress is filled with subplots, especially the recurring presence of Sarah Young, the woman engaged to Tom before he inherits his money and sets off on his journey of recklessness. Tom is in prison, but even now she has not abandoned him fully, although the extent of his fall clearly shocks her.
Hogarth wasn't the first person to do stories in series of pictures. In fact, there is quite a history of that going back to the late Middle Ages. But I think it's true to say that he was the person who dramatised it more successfully than anyone else. The way in which he makes it such a serious genre. He tells the stories about moral subjects, subjects that are to do with people's ideas and thoughts. So he gives it a new kind of importance.
Each painting in the series is also enhanced by Hogarth's mastery of literary detail. In the drunken tavern scene, the presence of a box of mercury pills reveals that Tom has already contracted syphilis. In the same image, we can also see paintings of Roman emperors, all of them defaced, except that of the notoriously corrupt Nero. In scene 6, set in a gambling house, the building is obviously on fire, but none of the players notice, least of all Tom Rakewell. Details such as these provide meat on the bones of the unfolding narrative, just as a novelist or playwright incorporates similar subtleties into his literary work. Hogarth's achievement was such that, in the early 19th century, the renowned critic Charles Lamb claimed that he was the visual equivalent of Shakespeare.
Hogarth had really quite immense powers of observation. There are little details that he picked up, little areas of light and shade. We can read it as small little incidents that are going on off stage, if you like, and yet it doesn't interfere with the main action, so that it kind of rounds out the whole basis of what he wants to say within each painting.
The prints of the Rake's Progress proved popular, but Hogarth was unable to find a buyer for the paintings. Works by European painters, particularly Italians, were highly sought after at the time. In 1734, the Italian Jacopo Amignoni received a commission to decorate the staircase of the new St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Hogarth, the nationalist, was furious. He announced to the hospital authorities that he would paint the staircase for free. This defiant gesture won him the prized commission. By 1736, Hogarth had completed 2 huge canvases, which revealed the extent of his ambition. Both of them were history paintings, then considered the greatest of all artistic genres, and both depicted tales taken from the New Testament. The story of the Good Samaritan and the occasion when Jesus cured a lame man at the pool of Bathsheba. These are very different paintings from those of the Rake's Progress series. Hogarth's intention was to prove that an English artist could work in the so-called grand manner, a Baroque approach pioneered in continental Europe.
Grand manner was a term used for history painting, and it was also called the great style. Academies in France and elsewhere thought that history painting was absolutely the top of the tree as far as art was concerned. Then right down the ladder you come to things like portraiture, still lives and so on. Rubens was a great exponent of that sort of art, and also people like Titian, Van Dyck. Before Van Dyck came over here, he painted quite a few historical pictures.
Hogarth was really no history painter. That was just not where his strengths lay. His strengths lay in producing, very particularly, these series paintings like Maréchal and Mode and Harlot's Progress and Rake's Progress.
One of the early influences in his life was Sir James Thornhill, whose daughter he eventually married. Sir James Thornhill represented the grand manner in British art at that time. He'd done the great decorations at Greenwich, and he was also working on works at St. Paul's as well. And I think Hogarth really did want to arrive. It's almost as though the modern moral subject took him by surprise, but ultimately he still wants to be the great artist, the artist for eternity. So I think he really did take the idea of being a grand manner artist very seriously.
As a result of his work for St. Bartholomew's Hospital, Hogarth secured a small number of subsequent history commissions, including Moses before Pharaoh's daughter in 1746, and Paul before Felix, 2 years later. This canvas is strongly influenced by the Renaissance master Raphael. But Hogarth's work lacks the strength of compositional structure that characterizes the greatest Italian paintings. A similar weakness can also be seen in Moses before Pharaoh's daughter, another religious image which can still be seen in London at what was once known as the Foundling Hospital. This institution is now known as the Thomas Coram Foundation, after the man who founded it in 1739. Here we can see Thomas Coram in a portrait painted the following year.
Hogarth was eventually a governor of the Foundling Hospital when it was built, but there was no money to adorn the walls of this enormous great building which held 500 children at one point. He got together other English artists and said, why don't you paint portraits or pictures and give them for free to the hospital and let them be hung on the walls and be seen by the visitors to the hospital. That was the first place where English art had actually been displayed to the public.
In portraiture, the principal influence is Van Dyck, the great painter who worked for Charles I. And he even hung the sign of Van Dyck outside his own studio to show his allegiance. Something that you can see in his Captain Coram. It doesn't look exactly like a Van Dyck, but you have a lot of the same kind of paraphernalia, the curtain, the seat, the days. It's as though he's trying to reinterpret Van Dyck, make him relevant for the modern age.
A similarly Baroque sense of confidence is visible in this image of Bishop Benjamin Hoadley of 1743, while this image of 1745 is also a study in the high status of the sitter, in this case, Hogarth himself. But Hogarth was capable of conveying more than Baroque grandeur in his portraits. We can see this in his portraits of children, the Graham children being one example. During the 1740s, children were normally painted as miniature adults, stern-faced and lacking the spirit of their youth. Hogarth ignored this convention. His children are characterized by a sense of exuberance, with the boy delighted that his music has caused the goldfinch to become excited. In his joy, he does not notice the real cause of the bird's frantic activity.
When it comes to portraiture, Hogarth was really one of the greatest that Britain's ever produced. And because he was so interested in character, when it came to simple, straightforward portraits, he had the ability to produce the elegance and the sophistication that people had, or the simplicity in an ordinary person's face, and yet draw out all the essence of that person's character. He never actually really valued it much. He used to call it fizmongering, because he thought that it was just producing things for clients, really. It wasn't really saying what he wanted to say.
Perhaps what I think we can appreciate about Hogarth's portraiture is that it's so lively. You feel he's really showing them as living people. But that didn't necessarily mean that people at the time appreciated it. And I think that to some extent he didn't show the kind of reserve that people expected from portraits at that time. And it was this lack of reserve in his work that meant that he was not as much used as perhaps one would expect he should have been.
Hogarth's portraits make up most of his life's work, and this was certainly due to financial considerations. The Protestant established church had no call for visual art, and commissions for history paintings were rare. Portraiture offered substantial rewards. Hogarth had cause to appreciate this in 1745 when he created this famous English portrait. This is David Garrick, one of the greatest stage actors of all time, in the role of King Richard III. This portrait earned Hogarth the enormous sum of 200 guineas and remains one of his best-known works. But in the same year as the completion of this timeless image of the English theatre, William Hogarth completed what is, for many, the greatest achievement of his career. A new series of 6 modern moral subject paintings, telling the story of an aristocratic marriage of convenience, the Marriage à la Mode. As with his previous cycles of paintings, the Marriage à la Mode was successfully made available as an engraved print.
The marriage was concerned with 2 people, one of whom was rich and one poor. And so the parents of that young couple were trying to intermix the two so that they would be neither poor nor rich. But it's quite obvious that right from the start that the young couple don't like each other. And it gets worse and worse as the paintings progress. So I think the message he's trying to get across is that you should actually marry for love and not for high expectations of wealth.
With his Marriage à la Mode series, Hogarth really came to the pinnacle of his work in this series of paintings that he called his modern moral subjects. It gives us a complete expression of what this strata of upper-class society was really like. And it shows us all kinds of little detail besides the main action.
The Marriage à la Mode series begins with negotiations for a wedding. An old nobleman, the aptly named Earl of Squander, has lived up to his name by frittering away his family fortune, and is now attempting to marry his son, Viscount Squanderfield, off to a girl from another wealthy family. The negotiations are about money, and not the emotional happiness of the couple. The couple's coldness towards one another does not bode very well for a happy marriage. The wily lawyer, Silvertongue, is introduced, a figure whose role will be crucial as the visual narrative develops. Our suspicions are tragically confirmed over the following 5 scenes. In the second image, there is a physical distance between the now married couple. The Viscount has been out gambling, and his steward realizes that this is not the time to bring up the household's unpaid bills. Both husband and wife share a spendthrift nature. In scene 4, we see the Countess entertaining lavishly and clearly interested in the charms of Silvertongue. If we suspect infidelity in the Countess, we already know of the Viscount's indiscretions. In scene 3, he visits a notorious quack doctor, and Hogarth's audience would have been left in no doubt that Viscount Squanderfield has also fallen victim to the scourge of syphilis. Worse is to come for Viscount Squanderfield. His wife's feelings for the dastardly Silvertongue lead to their sharing a love nest in a seamy area of London. But the Countess's infidelity is discovered by her husband, who has no choice but to duel with his love rival, a fight which he loses. As he dies from his wounds, Silvertongue escapes through a window as the authorities arrive. But he does not get far. In the final scene, a newspaper reveals that he has been hanged for murder. The Countess, too, is now on the point of death, having taken poison to end her life. Her daughter alone appears concerned, but the life of this little girl has also been blighted already. The black spot reveals that she has inherited her father's syphilis, in a final, unhappy end to the Marriage à la Mode.
Marriage à la Mode is one of his best painted series. He himself thought that it was his best achievement in that direction. It does, of course, technically give you more variety than perhaps one had found elsewhere. You can see all kinds of scenes, night scenes, day scenes. It's almost as though he's tried to stage each one in some different kind of room. You will notice that in the marriage contract, for example, that you can see works by old masters on the walls, and he's doing little miniature paintings of them, as though to show he can cope with all the different styles. So I think to some extent it's a tour de force, it's a virtuoso piece in which he's trying to show he can handle all types of paintings, from the detailed to the more evocative types.
As with his previous series of paintings, It is the details of Marriage à la Mode that enables us to follow the narrative completely. The seeds of all the disasters to come are visible from the start. Outside the window, we see a huge and indulgent Palladian mansion, still unfinished. This is what has cost the vain old Earl his fortune. But we soon see that his son is also financially irresponsible. Playing cards left lying on the floor give a clear indication of a gambling habit that leads inevitably to empty pockets. Hogarth's mastery of informative detail continues right through to the final scene, where the Countess's father is sadly oblivious to her plight. Instead, he is trying to remove her valuable wedding ring while he still can. If all this seems harsh, then we should remember that the young couple's misfortunes have been brought upon themselves, and this, ultimately, is the moral message that Hogarth tried to convey.
Like a lot of bourgeois people, Hogarth was very critical of the aristocracy. He saw them as being feckless, as being selfish, as being immoral. He was quite a moral person himself. So he wasn't against marriage, he was against the idea of the bourgeois marrying the aristocrat. He was himself married, and it seems to have been a very happy marriage, and although they never had any children, and that could have been for all sorts of reasons, of course, certainly they were close together. He wasn't complaining against marriage, and he did plan a series on the happy marriage. It was about people trying to get out of their station, so to speak.
Hogarth was a very sort of fluid painter, almost calligraphic. So you get this kind of vibrant, shimmering colours, costumes and things like that, for example. And I think that greatly enhances the whole look of both the paintings. And in fact, curiously, paintings are actually painted in reverse. And the image looks at its best when it's inverted the other way around, which the engraving process then did.
Marriage à la Mode is widely considered to be the finest achievement of William Hogarth. He demanded the most talented engravers to prepare the printed version of the work, but in the 1740s, the best in the business were French. Hogarth was perfectly prepared to put his prejudices aside in pursuit of his own professional interests, and in 1743, he travelled to Paris to engage the finest engravers in Europe.
Despite his xenophobia, he uses French engravers for Marriage à la Mode, and really you can see that he's looking very closely at French painting. It has a great influence on him. His interest in nationalism was very much related to his desire to defend his own pitch. After 1740, England is at war with France, and that gives him a greater opportunity. There is a growing antipathy to the French, which one sees really generating in Britain right up to the 1760s. So that is a kind of wave that he can ride on. And I think that he's really trying to exploit a situation.
Hogarth's first visit to Paris was successful in its aim of securing the best engravers for the Marriage à la Mode series. But in 1748, another visit to France was less auspicious. In the port of Calais, he was arrested for painting the city's fortified defences. It was a time of great suspicion between France and England. Typically, Hogarth turned the whole event into an artistic triumph for himself, with this canvas showing himself painting at Calais Gate, while a group of unattractive Frenchmen gaze longingly at a sirloin of British beef. For much of his later career, Hogarth continued to create popular images inspired by contemporary events. His famous Gin Lane remains the definitive visual image of inebriated London in the early 1750s, a time when it was estimated that a quarter of the city's population was drunk at any given moment. Later in the decade, he turned his attentions to the sleaze and corruption of politics, with a series of paintings illustrating a parliamentary election.
They're concerned with the Oxfordshire election, and one of the main characters is Bob Doddington, who is being carried aloft in a picture called Chairing the Member. Hogarth again uses a bit of satire, for example, a crowd of swine which are rushing into this river, and I think that's a reference to the biblical, the Gadarene swine.
Elections in those days were very public events. Voting was public, and there were lots of celebrations and suppers to get people to vote, and then of course to celebrate afterwards. So they are really showing huge groups. They're showing crowds in action, and that's perhaps one of the most technically accomplished sides of the picture. They are physically larger than the others. He only did 4 of them, so he compensated for the lack of numbers of scenes by size. In that sense, you can say it represents a bit of a change from his earlier scenes.
The background, I think, to the election series was this notion that he had of a complete moral decline, a national moral decline. And so the election series becomes a perfect metaphor for that and for how the corrupt influences were undermining the nature of the state.
The 1750s also saw Hogarth continue to work as a portraitist, and it is likely that this image, called the Shrimp Girl, dates from this period. Hogarth was wealthy and well known in London. In 1749, he bought this fine country house in the West London area of Chiswick, by which time he had achieved most of his artistic aims. With this in mind, it is unfortunate that the final years of Hogarth would be dogged with difficulties, some of which were of his own making. In 1758, he heard that a painting, believed to be by the Italian master Correggio, had been sold for over £400. Arrogantly, he announced that he would paint the same subject, the tragic heroine Sigismunda. It was a decision Hogarth would later regret.
He painted for somebody a picture called The Lady's Last Stake, in which she's shown losing at cards, and she has to decide whether she's going to go to bed with this chap or not. And this was so much liked by another man. He asked if Hogarth would paint a similar sort of picture. But Hogarth, for some reason, decided he wouldn't. He wanted to paint something historical. She is mourning the death of her lover, and she has in her hand some kind of cup that holds the heart of this man, and her eyes are dripping tears. And it's a rather repulsive sort of painting, in a way. The person who had asked for Hogarth to paint a picture was so repelled by it, he wouldn't actually buy it. And it was more or less after that universally reviled.
The Sigismunda was received badly, partly because people didn't expect Hogarth to succeed in that kind of work, which is rather unfair. They thought of him as a vulgar painter, and they were rather annoyed that he was trying to do something that was so well behaved. Quite honestly, I think, to look at the picture, I think that the criticism of it was undeserved. I mean, if it had gone in anonymously to the Society of Artists in 1761, I doubt if there would have been any fuss about it. But it was because it was known that it was by Hogarth that people felt that he was really stepping out of his genre, so to speak. It was regarded almost a kind of arrogance for this painter of low-life scenes to try and do this tragic historical subject.
The Sigismunda affair was just one difficulty to affect Hogarth as he entered his 60s and the last years of his life. He fell out with many of his fellow artists over the question of establishing a Royal Academy of Art. Hogarth did not see the need for such a formal institution, but his was the minority view, and the Academy was eventually founded in 1768. His political views marginalised him. Hogarth was a supporter of the statesman, the Earl of Bute, whereas most of the artistic community backed William Pitt. Typically, Hogarth proclaimed his political allegiances in his art, with this image simply entitled The Times. Politics is ablaze, and Hogarth's favourite, the Earl of Bute, is attempting to extinguish the flames, while Pitt tries to keep them going. It was a deliberately provocative work, and Hogarth was strongly condemned for it. By the time this print was released, in 1762, he was already a sick man. The Times was his last image. On the 25th of October 1764, at his London home in Leicester Fields, Hogarth died. He was 66 years old.
I think one can find quite a lot of artists going through the history of Britain who are influenced. Political satirists, Gilray in his own time, and then going right up to the present, one could think of people like Stedman, for example, who were definitely influenced by Hogarth and who admire his work. One group that I'd point to in particular are the Pre-Raphaelites. Hogarth was very important for the Pre-Raphaelites, particularly Madox Brown, and there was in fact a club called the Hogarth Club that they set up in his honour. Hogarth's painting of modern moral subjects struck a terrific chord for them, particularly those Pre-Raphaelites who also wanted to address modernity. Whistler first was inspired to become an artist by seeing the engravings of Hogarth, and he remained a great admirer of Hogarth throughout his life. He loved The Shrimp Girl, that beautiful late painting by Hogarth, and took it as a kind of signature for himself. To come up to date a little bit more, David Hockney, whose own Rake's Progress is deliberately based on Hogarth's Rake's Progress, and himself has always been a great admirer. I think the pop movement in general did have a great debt to Hogarth because, again, of Hogarth's irreverence and his wish to treat modernity.
When we look at him as a painter, and particularly if we look at, for example, his portrait paintings, we can see that really he was one of the greatest natural painters that Britain's really ever produced. And his stature, in fact, is growing more. He's now being regarded purely as a painter, not simply as a storyteller, and that the message and the medium that he used were all part one and the same.
He used to be applauded as an artist who got British art off the ground. And from the modest beginnings of the paintings on the Foundling Hospital walls, eventually the Royal Academy was started.
Just 4 years after William Hogarth's death, the Royal Academy, whose inception he had opposed, was founded in London. Its first president was an artist well known to William Hogarth, a man already famous for his mastery of portrait painting, whose works are still treasured today. By 1768, this man was well on his way to securing his own status as one of the finest portraitists of all time, Sir Joshua Reynolds, the second of the English Masters.